cold and rainy again. It has a lot of nerve, but we're ready. I want to introduce Dr. Laurie Richmond, who is Professor of Environmental Science and Management at Cal Poly Humboldt and a California Sea Grant Extension Specialist. In 2018, she collaborated with Aldaron Laird to help found the Cal Poly Humboldt Sea Level Rise Institute, which is an academic tribal community partnership related to sea level rise on California's north coast. Richmond currently serves as the co-chair of the Institute and is focused on building networks within the regional community to plan and adapt to sea level rise in a just and equitable way. Aldaron Laird is an environmental planning consultant who has specialized in sea level rise vulnerability assessments and adaptation planning on Humboldt Bay. Since 2010, he's been active in promoting a regional approach to sea level rise planning on Humboldt Bay. He's also an avid kayaker who has circumvented all 102 miles of Humboldt Bay's shoreline. His photographs of Humboldt Bay were featured in an exhibit at the Morris Graves Museum of Art. He also is publishing some, I think at least 2 books. One is coming out or has come out. He can explain that to you. And I can't wait to see them. And he's giving courses as part of OLLI, which you may want to join. So hope to see you there. And thanks so much for everybody coming. Here are Dr. Richmond and Aldaron. All yours.
Hey, should I share screen?
Fire away.
Sure. I'll just briefly say hello. This might be my first time teaching a class where my mom is one of the students. So hi, Mom. And you know, when Aldaron and I leave, don't say bad stuff behind our back because my mom is going to be in the room. Yeah, I'm really excited to share the stage with Aldaron. We're going to be talking about the formation of an entity called the Cal Poly Humboldt Sea Level Rise Institute. And we'll tell more about that story, but Aldaron has a long legacy of studying the sea level rise issue locally. And when he was retiring, came to campus and us with the idea of designing an institute that could give it some longevity. And I'm so grateful he did that. And he's still a participant as he's retired, but it's neat how it's lived on. And we'll talk to you about the history and some of the things that are going on. And we thought we'd start with Aldaron giving kind of a presentation of some of the background on sea level rise on Humboldt Bay. And then I'll come in and talk about the Institute and some of the things we have going on and how you can see some of our products and get involved.
All right. Thanks, Laurie. So let's start off with, this is Tuluwat. It's in on the North Bay, just north of the Samoa Bridge. And this is the Wiyot's World Renewal Ceremonial Site. Wiggy is in the center of the Wiyot ancestral lands that stretch from Little River on down to Bear River, essentially. And so thought this would be a good place to acknowledge that we are in the Wiyot lands and waters. And this is a unique location. This is during a king tide, so you can see its vulnerability to sea level rise. So let's see. So to start with, Humboldt Bay is in the center of what's called the Eureka Littoral Cell. Essentially sediment coming out of the Eel River reaches the ocean, and the ocean currents move it north to about Moonstone, where it runs into the rocky shoreline, and south down to like the Centerville area. And so you can see there's a sand spit barriers that form Humboldt Bay. And in fact, the north and the south spit not only form Humboldt Bay, without them, the open ocean would just wash all the way in towards, say, Old Arcata Road, but they protect the bay from the winter storms and waves, you know, of the open ocean. So they're critical to Humboldt Bay's existence, is the north and south spit, and they're often overlooked as a key function of the bay. But when we look at the bay, we can break it into about 6 different hydrologic areas. We have the entrance of the bay through the jetties, and we have a deep navigation channel that connects a broad South Bay and an even larger Arcata Bay or North Bay, where we have exposed mudflats during low tide. But also there's 3 sloughs that flow into Humboldt Bay. We have the Mad River Slough that drains almost from Mad River across the bottoms and into Arcata Bay. And then we have Freshwater Creek coming down into the open area, the agricultural area along Eureka Slough. And then over south of Eureka, we have the Elk River Valley and Elk River Slough complex that flows into the bay. So those are the 6 general areas in the North and South Spit form Humboldt Bay. There's currently a project that's just now being completed. The final report should be released any month now. And it's the Humboldt Coastal Resiliency Project. And it looked at the shoreline of the Eureka littoral cell, including the North and South Spits of Humboldt Bay. And here's a figure that they've created. They have 13 units that they divided the shoreline, the sandy shoreline from Little River all the way down to Centerville. And they've identified the relative sea level rise rates for each of these cells. And up at the north end, where Little River is, sea level rise is occurring about the same as what the rest of the coast of California is. It's about 3.3 millimeters a year. But down here where the North Spit tide gauge is, it's averaging about 4.7 millimeters a year in relative sea level rise. And that's where the NOAA tide gauge is located. That tide gauge is recording the highest level of sea level rise on the entire west coast of the United States, right here in Humboldt Bay. But as you can see with the color coding going all the way down to Centerville Beach, the relative sea level rise is even far higher as we get down to Centerville Beach than it is where the tide gauge is at the U.S. Coast Guard station. So we have a really active sea level rise region. And one of our local scientists who's a member of the Sea Level Rise, Jay Patton and his group, did a vertical land motion study of our region and helped identify that we had the highest rate of sea level rise on the West Coast. And here's all the NOAA tide gauges on the West Coast of the United States. The one in yellow is the highest recorded sea level rise. That's the North Spit tide gauge. But what's really unique is that right next to us, the next tide gauge is Crescent City, and it has the lowest rate of sea level rise on the West Coast. So side by side, we have the 2 extremes, and that's entirely due to the tectonic subsidence. The ocean has risen about 8 inches over the last century along the West Coast. But here on Humboldt Bay, because of tectonic subsidence, we've had an extra 10 inches of sea level rise over the last century, or a total of 1.5 feet. And locally, another scientist, engineer, who's a member of the Sea Level Rise Institute, Jeff Anderson, created a hydrodynamic model just of Humboldt Bay. And through his 3-dimensional modeling, he was able to generate and produce inundation maps. So in half-meter intervals, starting with mean high water and going all the way up through 2 meters, he's mapped out where the water would go all around the entire bay. So we have in half-meter intervals here, have 1 meter, 1.5 meters, and 2 meters showing here on Mad River Slough. So that enabled us to do site-specific vulnerability assessments on Humboldt Bay with a pretty good level of precision that the rest of the California coast doesn't have because they don't have a focused 3-dimensional model that was created. So one of the other unique things that has occurred on Humboldt Bay is, you may recall if you were here, New Year's Eve in 2005, we had a king tide and we had a winter storm and storm surge. And the highest water level ever recorded at the North Spit tide gauge occurred. It was 9.6 feet. And the governor declared a state of disaster. That high or extreme water elevation of 9.6 feet is really, it's only less than 1 foot higher than our average king tide, but it provided us a real-time, real-world baseline to see what areas are vulnerable with very little sea level rise going forward. Rather than relying just on models, we actually had a real world event occur in 2005. So with 1 foot of sea level rise, our average king tide will exceed that baseline elevation of 9.6 feet, or a state of disaster. With 2 feet of sea level rise, our monthly high tide will exceed that state of disaster level. And with just 3 feet of sea level rise, our daily high tide, our mean high water, will equal that level that was declared a state of disaster. So on Humboldt Bay, we're really needing to address sea level rise up front, not at the end of the century, but now. Looking historically, this is what Humboldt Bay looked like in the 1800s, 1870. It was mapped by the U.S. Coast Survey. The area in gold was salt marsh. There was about 10,000 acres of salt marsh, or about 40% of the tidal footprint of Humboldt Bay was salt marsh, and the other 60% was open water and mudflat. And the shoreline was only 60 miles long. Today, the shoreline is 102 miles long, and we have virtually no salt marsh. All of it has been diked off, and the bay has shrunk in its tidal extent. With 1 meter of sea level rise, it's projected, essentially the bay will reclaim the salt marsh, the thousands of acres of salt marsh that were taken away starting in 1890, and it'll again become part of the daily tidal inundation of the footprints. So we'll see a major expansion with 1 meter or 3 feet of sea level rise in Humboldt Bay. And on Humboldt, there's quickly, I wanted to show a couple of historical legacies that we've inherited. One was the diking of the salt marsh that started in 1890 and was essentially completed by about 1910, 1920. And they had a floating dredge that would dig a ditch, pile up all the mud at the edge of the salt marsh and create dikes. And it ended up diking off about 41 miles of shoreline on Humboldt Bay. And today you can see the earthen dikes. There's about 170 parcels that make up the 41 miles of dike shoreline. It's the most vulnerable element on Humboldt Bay to sea level rise because there's no bay-wide dike management district. You just have essentially upwards of 100 or more private parcels that are protecting this. And so dikes can breach, and if the dikes breach, the former salt marsh on the inside of the dikes is actually lower in elevation than the salt marsh on the other side of the dikes. Over the last 100+ years that they've been diked off from daily tidal inundation, they've actually subsided as the salt marsh is oxidized and the ground is compacted. And so the 41 miles of dikes on Humboldt Bay has created 24 hydrologic subunits. Each is individually vulnerable to breaching and flooding all of the land behind the shoreline. The other historical legacy I wanted to cover quickly is probably a point with the highest rate of shoreline erosion in California, if not on the West Coast. When the jetties were created in the 1890s, they ended up funneling all the wave energy in between this deep channel that's dredged on an annual basis by the Army Corps of Engineers, and it funneled all that wave energy at a big red cliff fronting a hill. It was called Booner Point or Booner Hill. And over the course of just 60 years, from 1890 to 1950, the shoreline eroded 1,480 feet until PG&E built a seawall at the base and stopped the erosion in 1950. And here's that seawall you can see here, and here's the king tide from last year, and the water is now reaching the top of the seawall and ready to go over. And here's the bluff that's left from the erosion, and right behind the bluff is where PG&E stored its spent nuclear fuel rods. They're in these silos, 115 feet back from the shoreline. And again, this is the location with the highest rate of erosion on Humboldt Bay, 1,500 feet almost in 60 years. And these silos are only 115 feet back from the bank. And the seawall is at the tipping point of being overtopped. With just 2 meters of sea level rise, which could probably occur before the end of the century, or about 7 feet, the spent fuel nuclear storage site essentially becomes an island. King Salmon would no longer exist. You would have to build a causeway in order to maintain the island facility for the nuclear fuels. So in summary, sea level rise impacts on Humboldt Bay could occur from tidal flooding as the water rises in elevation. It can also occur if the shoreline is eroded, like those earthen dikes. If they're eroded, then the lands behind would be tidally inundated with the very next day's high tide. The other sea level rise impact that many people don't think of is salt water is more dense than fresh water, the groundwater. And so as the salt water penetrates underneath the groundwater with rising tides, it will push the groundwater up until it emerges. So even if we rebuilt all the 41 miles of dikes, the low-lying former salt marsh behind it would become standing water with emerging groundwater in response to sea level rise, and it would no longer be agricultural land. And then with rising tides, the low tide rises as well as the high tides. The tide gates would no longer function with the rising. If we have 3 feet of sea level rise, all the tide gates on Humboldt Bay essentially would be blocked by low tides, and we would have stormwater runoff coming down, hitting the dikes in this wall and causing backwater flooding. And then lastly, saltwater intrusion of wells and sewer lines. And really, in closing, ground zero on Humboldt Bay for sea level rise vulnerability is the community of king salmon in the unincorporated area of Humboldt Bay. This is a king tide and king salmon now. With just a couple 1 or 2 feet of sea level rise, it's really going to be a challenge to maintain utility services and access to king salmon. And then in closing, the digital commons where all the sea level rise documents that have been produced on Humboldt Bay are now stored. The Humboldt County is leading an effort. They received funding from the Coastal Commission to begin sea level rise regional planning on Humboldt Bay. And that's a project that'll probably start shortly. Also, the county and one of our other Sea Level Rise Institute members created a stakeholder catalog by interviewing all of the entities and stakeholders that are involved with sea level rise on Humboldt Bay. And that catalog is available at the Digital Commons also, as well as the county's sea level rise vulnerability assessments for the Humboldt Bay Area Plan and the dike plans, and every other agency's reports are now stored there too. And as Jane mentioned, OLLI has a sea level rise special interest group. They meet the 3rd Thursday of every other month, and you're more than welcome to join us if you would like. And we talk about current events on sea level rise, new reports that have been released. So, and then lastly, this is the book that I hope to be sending to the printers this week, and it should be available in a month or so. And that's all I have, Laurie.
Thanks, Aldaron. I did not know about this photograph book. I'm really excited for that.
Yeah.
So can you stop sharing your screen? I think at
Yes.
the top, and then I'm able to. I don't know if folks have questions on some of Aldaron's presentation. We could take some now, I think, while I'm getting set up.
Sure. Any questions? That was pretty quick, I know.
I have a question, of course.
Okay.
The access, how long has this repository been available, and are people beginning to use it? And are the regional governments using it and paying attention to any of this?
I think I get those of us that are in the Sea Level Rise Institute, we get a monthly report from the Digital Commons, and they tell us how many documents have been accessed and how many times. And there's a lot of people that are accessing the documents. Besides the individual reports, the GIS databases, when you do all this mapping and modeling, the GIS databases are also available. And, we started doing sea level rise studies back in 2010. And so all of the documents that have been produced in our region since 2010 in the GIS databases are available at that Digital Commons. And if you go to the Sea Level Rise Institute website and you click on reports, it'll take you to the Digital Commons, and then you can just type in whatever topic you're looking for, and it'll call up the documents for you.
Who's managing that website? Is that funded by
I
whom?
believe it's managed by the Cal Poly Library.
Oh, okay. Great. Do they have, I mean, it would be interesting if the library would set up an area or a repository where people could easily access all this and it could be featured as a highlight in the library. Has anybody considered talking to them about that?
I don't know, but I mean, the library set up the back end for all of this. It's made it really easy. There's students who work for me, and every year we're like, send us any new reports. And there's student work on there. There's publications. There's a lot of government reports issued. So I've been on other projects that have set up repositories, and it's like thousands of dollars to like do all the work to like develop a software. So the library does a lot for us. The other thing that's kind of exciting is when a document gets indexed in the library system, it also becomes searchable through like Google and other browsers. So folks that are just like sea level rise on Humboldt Bay might just happen upon some of these things. You don't have to go through the document repository. So we get, you know, each document, you can look at how many times it's been downloaded, but all of them are like in the hundreds already.
And how long has this been available?
When did we start it, Aldaron? 2020 maybe, or something like that?
I think it was about 2020 is when the Digital Commons became active. So it's been about 4 years or so.
And Michael has a question. Michael, unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, my name is Michael Richardson, and I used to work for Humboldt County doing a lot of the sea level rise stuff, and it's kind of a one step forward, one step back sort of situation with the county where they got a grant to go big on sea level rise planning at a regional level. And they just don't right at this moment have the capacity to meet the deliverable schedule for that grant. And so they elected to step back and pursue a smaller initiative in the Fields Landing and King Salmon area. And maybe that's something you'll be talking about here in a little bit, Laurie.
Why did that happen, Michael? Did that happen because they don't have the capacity to take on the whole grant? I mean, what happens to the grant? Is it okay to just refocus it in a smaller range? Or
no, they pretty much, I think, abandoned that whole grant effort and substituted it for the smaller, more focused approach, which is going to do some of the same stuff, not looking at it as a kind of a mission of coordination with the cities, but rather looking at how to adapt to sea level rise. And in this case, we're talking about some disadvantaged communities that have a lot of low income residents. And so the focus is changing a little bit. Instead of going big with our regional partners, we're kind of taking a step back and just focusing on what we can accomplish on our own.
So Michael, my understanding is a little different from yours. The King Salmon Fields Landing is a separate project. It was funded by the state Coastal Conservancy. And so I don't think it's replacing the coordination efforts. I know that they've scaled that back some, but my understanding is that it is slowly progressing. And yeah, so it's a different grant.
Laurie, have they found someone to lead it now in the county?
I don't want to speak for what's going on in the county. Michael might know better. I mean, they had a lot of turnover, and I think they're kind of figuring things out. But yeah, I just will say that the Fields Landing King Salmon is kind of a separate initiative that was separately funded, and Cal Poly Humboldt was a partner in writing that grant. And I can't really speak to what's happening with the coordination stuff, but this isn't just a revisioning of that.
So as far as we know, the coordination among the jurisdictions is not happening or nobody in, I mean, does that mean they're gonna lose the grant? Or they're just waiting to find somebody to lead it?
Yeah.
I think the
Go ahead,
coordination,
Aldaron.
I think the smaller geographic scope of the King Salmon project raises all the issues that the larger regional planning project was going to have to address. And it just sounds like it's a more doable scale project. The regional planning project was in a way it was really ambitious to do. And when Michael left and other people left at the county, they really lost the knowledgeable talent, to be able to pull a project like that off. And I don't know that it's been replaced. So I think doing the King Salmon project, that Laurie and the Institute will be involved with, it will address all the same issues that the larger project, and maybe it'll be a stepping stone to doing the larger one eventually.
Who funded the original grant?
Coastal Commission, I think.
So
So do they just take their money back or what happens?
I do not want there to be a narrative that the county is not doing that project or has stepped away from it. I think they've ran into some bumps where they're rethinking the scope, but they are trying to initiate like coordination. There's the city, there's two cities, the county, the harbor district, the coastal commission, tribes. It's a lot of voices and a lot of different perspectives. And I think they are meeting and trying to figure out what frameworks works best. I think the hope was that would happen more quickly, but I don't think that it's right to perpetuate a narrative that they've completely abandoned that project.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear it. Pardon me for pursuing it, but I was very curious because it was pretty exciting to think they were actually going to get something going on a regional basis.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of differences in opinion about whether this should be formal or informal, and some jurisdictions don't want to coordinate and be told what to do. And so like, it's just, I think, more complex than they thought in terms of what will be workable. But as my understanding is those discussions continue to happen, and as interested, like we will be happy to support that. And as that is happening, it shouldn't stop place-based things, and like some really innovative stuff is happening. I mean, I'm really excited with the county's project, which we'll talk about, but the city of Arcata is doing some interesting planning around sort of the marsh and what they might do. The city of Eureka has funding to look at sea level rise planning and adaptation measures, and are maybe going to get funded to do more work. So there's, I think, innovative stuff happening in places, and how that might be linked to Baywide. There's a couple of ways that might happen, but I guess I wouldn't feel so downtrodden as it sounds you all are. I think there's so much happening right now and some real innovators in our local governments.
One of the
Great.
biggest challenges that project raised in exploring the feasibility of doing that is that Humboldt Bay is kind of unique on the coast of California, other than the San Francisco Bay region, in that surrounding the bay, except for the two spits, is former tidelands or salt marsh that's been diked off. All of that land has been retained by the state for development jurisdiction. It's all under the Coastal Commission's jurisdiction. And it really complicates the application of local coastal programs by local government. And when we looked at the feasibility of doing regional planning, that became a major issue on how, even the Coastal Commission has not really had to address that at the scale that would occur on Humboldt Bay. So I think it's smart to start with a smaller project and work our way up.
Thank you for addressing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, and as far as, challenges with capacity, I think that's something that the Sea Level Rise will talk about. Institute has thought about, like, how can we and our partners be partners so that we can be more together, and looking at innovative models, including a partnership with the county, which I'll talk about later. All right. So I'm going to share my screen now, if I can. Here it is, sorry. Can you all see it? It seems to be being slow to load. Here we go. Okay. Can you all see the slides?
Yes, we've got the side ones as well.
Here we go. All
There
right.
you
So you heard from Aldaron some of the background of how this is such an important issue. And I think I just want to take a moment to just acknowledge the legacy of Aldaron. I think a lot of you have been to several presentations with him and seen the amount of work that he's done over the years to present this as an issue. When I first moved here, so I've been here about 11 years, around that time, the state of California issued a sea level rise report of the state of sea level rise in California. And the report basically said, like, anything north of Sonoma is fine because the land's uplifting, no issue. And there were people locally in Humboldt Bay that were like, wait a minute. Because of the tectonic action in our region, there are really some localized issues, specifically in Humboldt Bay, that the land is sinking. And they had to kind of call the alarm and tell the state, like, hey, this is an issue here and your report's incorrect. And I think it started something that folks in our region realized sort of like we had to be self-sufficient and to develop and do the analyses ourselves, or we were going to be kind of ignored and overlooked. And Aldaron played a big role in sort of starting that and helping bring in a lot of grant dollars and doing a lot of all the foundational work and mapping work of putting all the pieces together so that we can sort of understand what the picture is and what we're facing. And our community owes a great debt, and I owe a great debt because he kind of handed me a new career. And so, yeah, so he approached me around 2018 to build something together to give it a home. And initially we were called the Sea Level Rise Initiative because we weren't formally an institute, and we met informally for about 4 years. And then went through the process through the university of receiving formal designation, which isn't all that different, but we now get to call ourselves an institute, and we have a bank account, so it gives us some flexibility to raise funds to put on events and scholarships or do different things in a way that we couldn't really do as an initiative. So here's my background slide, but you just got a beautiful background for Aldaron, so I don't think you need to know it. But again, we're facing one of the fastest rates of relative sea level rise on the West Coast. We're rural in the scale of the state. We're often overlooked. And so there's this decision that, like, we've got to be our own advocates and we've got to do our own science. And that's been a really exciting part about building this initiative and sort of feeling empowered in this rural place. Aldaron talked a lot about some of the science. There's a lot of different concerns to think about with sea level rise. He showed pictures of king salmon, some of these residential areas that are low-lying. The Highway 101 corridor, many of you guys have probably driven by and then been like, oh, there's the bay. It's pretty close. So thinking about our transportation infrastructure, agricultural lands have the potential to be inundated from above or below. And for Wiyot descendants, there are cultural considerations to sea level rise as well. So what happened was in 2022, we formally formed as an institute, and to do that, we had to create a charter. So we had to develop sort of a vision statement and some values and goals, and I'll just outline those kind of quickly here. That we envision a diverse network of collaborators working together across disciplines, sectors, and ways of knowing to develop sea level rise research and planning that informs equitable, sustainable, and community-centered local climate action. And I really think that's the biggest thing we want to deliver is a network that really like this issue crosses a lot of boundaries, and we sort of understand it as sort of like everybody bringing the breast that they have to the table, whether it's from agencies, from tribes, from academia, from local government, from the private sector. Consultants are playing a big role in how we're thinking about and doing this work. I am currently co-chair. Co-chairs have like 3-year terms. The other co-chair is Adam Cantor, who's the director of the Wiyot Tribe's Natural Resources Department. So this is just quickly some of our values. Our collaboration. We try to do projects in teams and together, believing we're kind of stronger together. We value Indigenous leadership in terms of thinking about this issue and thinking about the future of the Bay. Interdisciplinarity. This work intersects so many different disciplines and ways of knowing. Justice and equity. Applicability. So we strive and seek to develop projects. Academia can sometimes be kind of high-towered where they just do things that are interesting to them. And we really seek to develop partnerships and do work that we think is going to help advance understanding and advance project and needs locally. Education is really key. We have undergraduates and graduate students embedded in this idea that they can move on and be part of this new climate workforce. And accountability. We want to stay true to what our values are. Some of our goals, they overlap a little bit with values. I won't go into it too much, but to build and maintain a network, to educate students, faculty, but also the public to make sure that, you know, the sea level rise guidance was just updated and that stuff's really confusing. And we've been sort of thinking through it and how would that be communicated and some of that science to the public. We want to focus attention on the issue. I think Aldaron's been a huge champion for that. Developing collaborative research, contributing to best available science, building capacity, you know, both among ourselves, but, you know, within our community, how can we build this capacity, keeping true, and being a model, especially for how we can do this work in a rural place that maybe has fewer access to resources. So it's been pretty amazing since Aldaron and I met in this like dingy room in the Natural Resources building with like 5 other people as we got this started. As of today, there are 51 people who are listed as part of our network. We don't always get 51 people at a meeting, but those are people that are seeing emails and notes and, you know, a part of our loose network. And that are in August of 2022 was 20 and 51. So there's a lot of interest in our work and we're growing, and that's really exciting. And this is just a smattering of some of the different folks that are part of it, from academia, folks from all these different departments, the private sector. There's 3 tribes who participate and are part of our conversations, NGOs. Oh, I got to change that. That's Humboldt Waterkeeper now. Regulatory agencies, so the Water Board, California Coastal Commission are part, and various government entities, local and state level, and federal, who are part of it. So that's just been really exciting to have new voices and perspectives. Basically, the way the network works is we meet once a month over Zoom, and 2 times a year we try to meet in person. And we have an array of topics. Some is just business. Some is we invite guest speakers to come in. If there's big policy updates or changes, we might invite someone to come in, like this latest update of the sea level rise guidance. We had a guest come in. We've also done things together, like built projects, and we wrote, I'll tell you in a second, we wrote a paper together. This is a document repository. And Aldaron hit on it pretty well, but I guess I'll just want to show you really quick the back end. It's kind of divided into these different sections. So you can go to local reports and publications. And it's by year, the different years that they were published. So it's pretty accessible, and we can look at something like let's see here. This one has had 24 downloads, so it tells you number of downloads. Here, this one I think has had a lot. 192 downloads. So that's pretty cool. This is a project that Aldaron helped support the county with, looking at communities at risk of Fields Landing, king salmon, and Fairhaven. All right. So in 2023, we wrote a paper together. In a minute, I'll put a link to it. You all can read it. Where we kind of described a little bit. So as many of you know, we were called Humboldt State University, and now we're called Cal Poly Humboldt. And there was a special issue of the Journal of Humboldt Social Relations about sort of visioning a polytechnic. And we sort of envisioned like, how could, as becoming a polytechnic, how might we think about sea level rise? And through this, we kind of described the genesis of our institution or institute and who we are. And it's called Transformative Sea Level Rise Research and Planning, Establishing a University, Tribal, and Community Partnership for Resilient California North Coast. I don't know if anytime soon I'm going to lead a paper with 30 authors, but it was really interesting and exciting to bring all of these different perspectives together. And the way that we did it was we had sort of 5 different sort of disciplinary or ways of knowing sections that individual people took leadership on of these different aspects of sea level rise. And we looked at sort of what work had been done to date and what are kind of some visions for work that should be done in the future in these areas, and how this field can sort of apply to sea level rise. And we kind of lay out this vision for sea level rise research and planning under these 3 headings: equitable, resilient, and transformative. And you all may, how many of you have heard this concept of like transformative adaptation? It's kind of a academic-y fun term.
Does it have a translation into common language?
Yeah. So a lot of times you might have heard about like climate transitions, right? That we're going to be transitioning, or you might hear about climate adaptation. And a lot of that is sort of like, we're going to transition to an energy system, but in a lot of ways, we're going to kind of keep the status quo, that we'll sort of like have this lovely transition, but society will relatively be the same. And some academics have developed this term called climate transformations, which is the idea that all of this disruption from climate change and the fact that we need to like reorganize and rethink things provides a window of opportunity for us to do things differently, whether to focus more on equity and justice, or to kind of rethink our relationship with the natural world, where maybe we were kind of trying to fight to keep water out for so long, and we could have these new visions where we like coexist with water or coexist with nature. So understanding that as an opportunity to kind of transform ourselves as society, like it's rare that we would ever as a society have such a window with so much potential for change. And so the scholars have given this term transformative adaptation. And for me, I feel like climate change and sea level rise, especially as a teacher, can feel like such a downer. It's just like really, you can just feel depressed. And I think it's really exciting to frame it as an opportunity. And for students that are coming in and working in this field of what exciting careers they'll have, to think about all these things and to transform kind of what our infrastructure, what our societies, and what our systems look like.
It's a positive point of view. It's like, okay, what's the future going to look like, and how can we get there to take into account the changes we're experiencing?
Yeah, yeah. That we can remake our worlds as we're adapting to climate change. Yeah.
That's a positive approach compared to climate grief.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So there is a marine and coastal science section. I just thought this figure they embedded was really interesting, looking at how in absence of some intervention or restoration, sea level rise has the potential to affect and potentially contribute to the loss of important coastal habitats. So looking at like as the waters start to rise, certain habitats start to go away unless you can remove those dikes and kind of take the water out. But the dikes mean some of those shallow water habitats can be lost. So that there's a lot of restoration and ecological implications of sea level rise too. So some of the things, we just have a network and we try to help projects happen. Sometimes we're writing a letter of support. Sometimes there are people from Cal Poly Humboldt that are partners on the project. You know, sometimes we're supporters behind the scenes on projects. Sometimes we're leading projects. There's just a lot of different ways that things happen and things get aligned. Something that I think has been really exciting over the years that Aldaron and I have been involved is that the Wiyot tribe has emerged as a real leader in sea level rise planning. And I think the state recognizes them and are often calling on them to think about sea level rise policy. And there's been a series of successful grants that the Wiyot tribe has gotten to build sea level rise planning and capacity from their perspective and values. The biggest project that was Cal Poly Humboldt Sea Level Rise was a sort of partner and supporter of was a project for the Wiyot tribe to acquire an acre of a parcel of coastal land, 46 acres, called Marashawak, and do some restoration work on that site. Some other stuff, a colleague of mine, Jen Marlowe, has been leading a really important project. This is something Aldaron's been sort of waving the flag on for a while. I know some of you mentioned it. I'll put in the chat. This is a North Coast Journal article. The title of it is 44 feet, but thinking about sort of scenario planning and thinking about our stored spent nuclear waste that is stored in that cliff that Aldaron showed you is sort of facing sort of wave action. And 44 feet is how many feet that waste is from the face of the cliff. And so that has been a really exciting initiative that's led to a grand jury report and a lot of slow movement. It's those organizations that oversee nuclear waste are very confidential and private, but seeing some of the cracks open, that's been really exciting to see. Cal Poly Humboldt is partnering with Caltrans, the engineering department, looking at some of the coastal hazards along the 101. This is Andrea Pickart, who did a lot of that, been a part of a lot of that dune restoration work that Aldaron mentioned before. Jen Call from Humboldt Waterkeeper just is producing a podcast on sea level rise, and they just released their first one. You can see it here, but capturing local voices and perspectives on sea level rise. So it's just throughout the network, there is so much exciting stuff happening. And this has been mentioned a couple of times, but Aldaron and the county had a communities at risk project. So there are 3 low-lying communities sort of that are sort of most at risk in sea level rise in the soonest time frame. And these communities actually already flood during king tides. And so, you know, they are flood adapted communities. They live with flooding. And Aldaron kind of sort of rang the bell on this and had some workshops in those communities to kind of present them for the first time with some of these projections and talk about what they might like. And I think the county recognized the importance of having some more follow-up with the community and maybe thinking about how could we think about different adaptation strategies. And so this is going to be in King Salmon is here and Fields Landing are here. And I always recommend breakfast or lunch at Gill's. I love going out to King Salmon. And, you know, these are some projections of flooding that over certain timeframes, and those timeframes are shifting with some of the new recommendations. But it could be that, you know, on a monthly basis, even the road in and out of the community could flood. And so some conversations around, you know, the residents thinking about what that might look like, or what are some adaptation strategies. But because flooding is a now problem, there may be some mitigation that could be implemented now to alleviate some of the flooding issues at present, as well as thinking into the long term. And here is, this is Fields Landing, some of the sea level rise maps. A lot of the way flooding occurs is actually through the storm drain system, like it comes back up through the drains that are meant to drain through the ocean. Yeah, and so the project is a partnership with Humboldt County, their Public Works Department, their Long Range Planning Department, which I don't know if Michael's still here, but his old department. And they're going to lead the effort, but Cal Poly Humboldt is going to support the community engagement. And something that we're really excited to try and experiment with is different strategies to engage the community and sort of thinking and talking about flood issues now, and thinking and envisioning what they'd like to see for the future, and really kind of trying to center the community in some of those discussions. And so, yeah, we're really excited to help and support that project, and that'll be one of the new big things that we have going on. All right, I will stop sharing and we can take questions.
Speak now or forever hold your peace. How much is the rising concern, or the rising concerns about king salmon, et cetera, affecting the real estate market there? What are people doing with their properties? Are they trying to adapt and build up? Are they getting funding? Can they get insurance anymore? I know insurance has been a major problem along the coast in various places, including where there are fires. So sea level rise is yet another concern. Are the insurance companies paying a lot of attention to that?
Is there anyone here who lives in King Salmon or Fields Landing? I wouldn't want to speak.
They're bailing.
Aldaron, maybe you have some thoughts. I mean, it is among the cheaper places to buy houses. And I have to imagine some of that is linked to the flood risk. They're lower income communities.
When we had the workshop, Laurie, a couple of people that lived in King Salmon said that they had trouble, getting flood insurance, to cover their mortgage, but eventually they were able to get that. I've often thought that the insurance underwriters will probably be one of the larger motivating factors, for the state and federal government to step in and try to provide some assistance to unincorporated communities like King Salmon.
Is the flood insurance from the state?
It's federal.
It's federal. Oh, okay. I bet it's pricey.
It is, yeah. It's the same flood insurance you would get if you lived in like a flood prone area, like by a river or a creek. It's the FEMA flood insurance program. It's a national flood insurance program, which there are a lot of national conversations around that because our national flood insurance program is bankrupt or really, really in debt, because the amount of money the federal government collects in premiums, we have to pay out more for folks to rebuild. So there's a lot of conversations at the federal level of how to make that more solvent. And that means having maybe better estimates of flood risk. It means increasing rates potentially, and trying to possibly encourage the homes in the most flood risk areas, if they call them repetitive loss properties. So if you have a home that's been flooded and rebuilt or partially rebuilt, and then flooded again and rebuilt and partially rebuilt. That's like a property they're continuing to spend money on, and realizing that it might make more sense if they just bought out the property than to continue to rebuild it.
And that's
So-
what's been going on in Alaska, right?
I don't know about Alaska specifically, but that is federally like a conversation that's been happening in a lot of different places. And it used to be that folks were really resistant to the idea of like a federal buyout of their home. And when they've experienced, you know, more than one flood and had to rebuild, I think there's a shift that some folks are kind of more interested in taking that deal to not be in an at-risk area anymore.
There was actually a state bill a couple of years ago that would have bought out at-risk properties. Mostly it was geared towards bluff retreat on the coast of California and some very expensive properties that would be at risk, that they would be bought out and the residents would be allowed to stay there until it was no longer safe. And I thought that that type of an approach would have been really a godsend for the people in King Salmon and Fields Landing, you know, but of course the bill didn't pass, or wasn't signed into law. So, but that could be resurrected again.
Yeah, there have been 2 attempts. So a lot of times it's been given the term managed retreat of folks that are in at-risk areas. And I'm not saying this should be advocated for in King Salmon or Fields Landing. I think more science needs to be done. But there have been 2 bills looking to like pilot and fund that in the state. And both passed overwhelmingly in the legislature and were vetoed by Newsom. So Newsom has a very anti-managed retreat stance, which is
Yeah.
kind of interesting.
And,
Does
you know,
anybody know why?
Probably real estate interests. And that he may eventually be looking to pivot to run for national office and want to look more middle of the road. I don't know.
it's really a challenge in an area like King Salmon and Fields Landing because they're not a municipality. They're the unincorporated area of the county, you know, and their water and sewer services are provided by a community services district. You know, the county maintains the roads, you know, and the Coastal Commission controls, you know, the development and building, you know, in those communities. So it's a very complicated, it's not like living in Arcata or Eureka where you just go to, you know, the city government, get a building permit, and you can, and it's one entity that takes care of your utility services and your access. It's a lot more complicated in those communities.
Is it likely that Caltrans is going to take a more progressive look at what sections of 101 are going to be underwater in the near future and plan for it, since it takes them so bloody long to do a project?
Well, I know that Caltrans did a district-wide sea level rise study to identify the road segments that are vulnerable to sea level rise, and then they prioritize those state highways, probably so that that would help them, you know, allocate funding for planning and construction and whatnot. And so they've identified, you know, the segments of Highway 101 as it traverses Humboldt Bay that are vulnerable to sea level rise, and they're all the highest priority, 1 to 4. They're all 1 priorities. Highway 255 that goes from Arcata over to Manila is really vulnerable, but it received the lowest priority of a 4. So it's, you know, probably based on ridership, how many people use Highway 101 versus Highway 255, you know. So yeah, Caltrans has a limitation in that there are they can spend planning dollars in an area where they have a construction or a maintenance project funded. If they don't have a construction or maintenance project funded, it's difficult for them to spend funding on planning. Like they're not doing a lot of planning design for South Bay on Highway 101, but they're doing a lot on the 101 corridor between Eureka and Arcata.
Is there any way to stimulate them to consider that? Where we're
Well, the entity that's been poking them to do it is the Coastal Commission, which has required in their coastal development permits for them to consider sea level rise. And Aldaron's right, it's not happening across all transportation areas, but the 101 corridor, like there's been huge studies and looking at living shoreline and looking at phase adaptation and even actually the sort of Arcata to Eureka bike trail is a little bit elevated, that can be, that it won't last in all time frames, but can act as a little bit of a buffer and protection in the short term. And yeah, they're funding some engineering folks to look at hazards on the 101. So it's spotty where it is, but there is a lot of, I think, research and attention funding looking at it, especially like Aldaron said, on something they're going to implement.
Caltrans did do a pilot study on 101, and they selected the Arcata Bay, and they looked at potential alternatives due to sea level rise. And the outcome of that study, I was involved with that. It was, I think, back in 2018 or earlier than that, was that, you know, putting 101 on a causeway is probably the long-term solution, and maybe combining services on a causeway where you would have a causeway, a trail, and utility infrastructure like water lines and sewer lines or gas lines, something like that. That building a new Highway 101 in a different location didn't look like a viable alternative compared to building a causeway.
Yeah. I wonder what the time frame for that would be. Be interesting.
We'll look at how long it takes them to plan anything down on Highway, I think 37 down in the Bay Area. It's very similar to our Highway 101. They're looking at building it up as a causeway, but in the interim, they're going to raise the elevation of the highway by 10 feet while they build a causeway next to it. And so it seems like with Caltrans, they operate on a decade time scale as far as planning and building and constructing. So I don't know. We don't really have a large population base or a real high value real estate. You know, like Laurie says, oftentimes we get overlooked at state level planning.
Interesting. Anybody have any more questions? Or any questions? Did we miss anybody? Raise your hand. Anybody? Michael, do you have anything further?
I have a question.
What's that?
Aldaron, congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
Are you self-publishing or are you going through a publishing house?
Cal Poly University Press is publishing it.
Well, fantastic. Please let us know when your book signing is.
Yeah, I'm hoping that we can send it to the printer this week. And so I imagine in another month or so, we should be able to have a signing. Actually, the Humboldt Bay Symposium, which the Sea Level Rise Institute is putting together this year in April, I'll be doing a book release and book signing there.
Great.
Oh, that's great. What's the date of that? April what?
14 to 17, is that correct, Laurie?
11th to the 13th, I think.
11 to
Is that
13.
open to the public?
Yes.
Yeah, here's a link.
It's at
Great.
the Humboldt County Schools over there on Myrtle Avenue is that meeting hall.
Oh, okay.
The
That'd be
Sequoia
great.
Conference Center. I think registration is open now, so you can register.
How do we get access to that? Through you?
I just put the link to the website
Okay.
and there's a like Eventbrite link there.
Coastal Ecosystem
Institute.
Institute.
Coastal, yeah.
Is
That's
that
another
you?
local group.
Oh, it is
Another
another local group that's doing this? Okay. And they coordinate with you, Laurie?
The Coastal Ecosystems Institute is kind of like a nonprofit, but it's like a collection of volunteers. They put the symposium on about every other year, sometimes every third year, bringing together a variety of speakers to talk about issues related to Humboldt Bay. It's going to be a really cool symposium. It's the first time in person since COVID. And there's half a day on sea level rise. There's discussions of ecological restoration, offshore wind. There's a day on offshore wind and port changes that might be of interest to folks. fisheries and aquaculture. So yeah, a super great event. And the Sea Level Rise Institute is kind of organizing the Sea Level Rise talk. So there'll be some of our membership will be there helping to organize.
Oh, that's great. I hadn't heard about that particular group.
Actually, the Sea Grant has been a key person in sponsoring these symposiums all the way back to 2000. We've been holding these every other year, every 3 years, and so it's been a long time trend and stuff. But it's nice to see other groups take the lead on pulling it together too.
There's something also called the Sea Grant Institute.
Laurie, this is the University of California Sea Grant.
Yeah, so California Sea Grant. California Sea Grant is 50 years old. It's a federally funded program through NOAA that kind of creates a relationship between the federal government and the states. And they're all embedded in universities. Our Sea Grant is actually embedded down at in La Jolla at Scripps Institute at UC San Diego. And their job is to help connect coastal community members, fishing community members with sort of resources, science, knowledge, expertise related to ocean and coastal issues. One of our big strategic planning goals is around climate resilience. So trying to do work like the Sea Level Rise Institute to sort of like connect folks with knowledge and information to help do effective planning.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to seeing more about this in the future. And Aldaron, we're looking forward to your publication. And I know you're going to do an OLLI presentation on it as well, right?
Yes, I'm going to do an OLLI class on this book. I believe that's going to be in March.
Coming right up. You
Yep.
got to get it out the door.
Get it right.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you all. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week when we're going to be talking about the perils of Medicare Advantage and similar programs in terms of privatization of our Medicare system, which is a significant concern. So we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks,
all.
everyone.
And thank you,
Bye-bye.
Aldaron and Laurie.
Yeah, thank you, Laurie.
It's great to see you, Michael. Oh, he's gone.
Yeah,
Bye, Mom.
good to see you, Alder.
Yeah, good to see you, Michael. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Stay out of trouble.